Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to Holocaust Museum LA's 30th annual Yom HaShoah Commemoration ceremony. My name is Guy Lipa, and I am proud to serve as the museum's board chair. As the grandson of Holocaust survivors, Yom HaShoah has always been a profound day for our family. It is a day when people all over the world pause to remember the 6 million who perished, honor our beloved survivors, and speak out against anti-Semitism, bigotry, and hatred. One of the museum's founding survivors, Siegfried Halbreich, once asked, "When the last survivor is gone, who will remain to tell the world?" Together, we steward the legacy of Holocaust Museum LA's founding survivors who wanted to create a reflective place to memorialize their loved ones and educate the public so that no one would ever forget. Their mission to commemorate those who perished, honor those who survived, and educate future generations about the Holocaust, and inspire a more dignified and humane world remains more critical than ever. Just this week, the ADL published its annual audit of anti-Semitism and incidents for last year. 2021 reached an all-time high, an average of more than 7 incidents of anti-Semitism per day in the US. Incidents at K through 12 schools increased 106%. This is why education is our greatest catalyst for change. Our in-person Yom HaShoah ceremony is a bit smaller than in years past, out of an abundance of caution for the health and safety of our survivor community. However, this smaller in-person group allowed us to hold today's ceremony in the Goldrich Family Foundation Children's Memorial. Each of the more than 1 million holes that you see surrounding the walls represent the 1.5 million children who perished in the Holocaust. You can see slips of paper left by students and visitors, each with a photo of a child who perished and inscribed with a message of hope, intention of goodwill, or a prayer for the future. Jonah Goldrich, for whom this memorial is named after, said, "It's important to teach the young generation about the Holocaust. The world wants to forget the biggest horrors mankind ever created, the murder of 6 million Jews by a country that was, at the time, considered the most cultured and enlightened in the world." We share Jonah's charge when he said, "I am fighting against forgetting." I want to acknowledge several special guests in the audience today. Could you please raise your hands when I call your name, and we will hold all applause till all the names are called. Los Angeles Mayor Eric Garcetti. Los Angeles City Controller, Ron Galperin. Council member for the 5th District, which we are in, Paul Koretz. Consul General of Israel, Dr. Hillel Newman. Consul General of Poland, Jaroslaw Lasinski. The Honorable Zev Yaroslavsky. Holocaust Museum LA Vice Chair Patsy Palmer. Treasurer Jamie Rosenblood. Board member Stephen Greinberg. And of course, the most important part of our guests here, both in person and virtually, Holocaust survivors Joe Alexander, Steve Kovry, Luis Lerner, Dana Schwartz, Henry Slucky, Joshua Kaufman, Jerry Weiser, and Janine Strauss. Though we can't see you to wave, I also want to acknowledge survivors who are joining us via live stream. Raul Artal, Helen Shaliff, Lou Fogelman, Joshua Kaufman, Erica Schwartz, Jerry Weiser, Joe Hess, Gabrielle Karen, Ernie Weiss, Ava Palmer, David Delanga, and Ava Tronk. Thank you to the Consulate General, and a round of applause for everyone that's with us, and especially our survivors. Thank you to the Consulate General of the Republic of Poland and the Consulate General of Germany for their generous support of today's ceremony. Thank you also to the ADL Los Angeles and the Wendy Museum for their community partnership. But last but not least, thank you again to all of our board members, family members of survivors, including 2G and 3G, children and grandchildren of survivors, docents, volunteers, generous donors, and especially our museum staff, of which our CEO, Beth Keane, is here, our head of education, Jordana Gessler, I saw, Lisa Barnett, who keeps the glue together for our building and for events like this, and all of those who are joining in person and online. At the start of the Holocaust in 1933, over 70% of the 10 million European Jews lived in Eastern Europe. 30% of Warsaw was Jewish, 40% of Vilna, and 26% of Kiev. These vibrant and diverse Jewish communities were decimated by the Nazis and their allies. While the Jewish population in Poland was over 3 million in 1931, by 1950, it was reduced to about 45,000. Think about that, from 3 million to 45,000. The first mass killings of the Holocaust did not take place in the gas chambers of Birkenau, Treblinka, Sobibor, or Majdanek, but in Eastern Europe, outside cities like Odessa, Kiev, Białystok, Minsk, and Vilna, where SS and German police personnel, often with local support, shot Jewish men and women and children. Over 1 million Jews were murdered by this Holocaust by bullets. One of the largest massacres by these units took the lives of nearly 34,000 Jews in just 2 days at the Babi Yar ravine near Kiev. As we look back at the experience of Eastern Europe Jews during the Holocaust, we also reflect on the devastating war in Ukraine and the growing humanitarian and refugee crisis we face today. It's horrifying to consider that 80 years later, Babi Yar was the site one of the first missile attacks by Russia just last month, and it's been confirmed that at least 2 Holocaust survivors have been killed. Holocaust Museum LA stands with the people of Ukraine and the millions of refugees. We continue our mission to educate about the critical lessons of the Holocaust, which teach us not only to bear witness to the atrocities committed, but also to the extraordinary acts of courage and resistance. I'd now like to welcome international Jewish leader and social justice activist Rabbi Denise Egger of Congregation Kol Ami to deliver the invocation.
Thank you, Guy. We take a moment of prayer and meditation. Ruach Elohim, holy breath of life, as we gather on this day to recall and remember and never forget the millions of people who were imprisoned and tortured and murdered during the Shoah, bless us with strength. The victims were carted in cattle cars like animals, gassed and shot, given lethal injections. They were starved and enslaved and sometimes buried alive. 6 million of our Jewish people targeted by hatred so vile and so heinous. Give us strength. Millions more people, Roma, the disabled, gay men and lesbians, Jehovah's Witnesses, political prisoners, trade unionists, Poles, and those of many other nations who were murdered by the Nazis. The children and the aged, the infirm, and those who were young and vibrant, tortured and murdered and turned to ash. Their lives cut short by cruelty and barbarism for simply being who they were. Oh God, give us strength. It's hard to fathom the scope and scale of violence and death, and yet our task on this afternoon is to confront the horrors of the past and to remember. Today, on this Yom HaShoah, Day of Holocaust Remembrance, we pay tribute also to the many survivors whose resilience in the face of such horror is a shining example of the human spirit to make meaning, to rebuild lives, and to be a living testimony and witness. Bless them, O God, with health and continued long life. Today, at this Yom HaShoah observance, we give thanks too for the liberators, brave soldiers who fought a brutal war to ensure that the Nazi regime would be defeated. For their courage and fortitude, we give thanks to you, O Eternal One. And with reverence and sanctity, we remember the lives of the soldiers called the greatest generation, who died to free the world of such hatred. May the souls of all the victims of the Shoah and those who died to fight the evil of that time be bound up in the bond of eternal life. Ruach Elohim, holy breath of life, grant us the fortitude and courage to challenge evil that is still in our midst, that cause us to hate another in our heart. We see unfolding before us the rise in anti-Semitism and anti-Asian hatred, and homophobia and transphobia and xenophobia. We see the despicable atrocities each night being inflicted upon Ukraine and its peoples. The Uyghur people in China are enslaved and in concentration camps today. Genocides are ongoing in Myanmar and South Sudan and the Congo. Humanity, we have not learned the lessons of the Shoah. Ruach Elohim, hear our prayer. Teach us not only to remember, but to act, to defeat tyranny and hatred wherever it arises, and to see all we meet as created in your divine image. So let us use this day to reach out to another in love, ve'ahavta re'echa kamocha, to love our neighbor as ourselves. Let us use this day, lo ta'amod al dam re'echa, to not stand idly by the blood of our neighbors who are targeted by hate. And let us use this afternoon, this Yom HaShoah observance, to v'ger letono v'tilchatzenu, to not oppress or exploit the stranger in our midst. And let us use today to remember, to honor, to reflect, to spur us to action wherever and whenever there is inhumane behavior. Ruach Elohim, holy breath of life, open our eyes, open our ears, open our hearts, and open our hands, O God, and strengthen us for the task ahead. Ken Yehi Ratzon, so may it be God's will. And now it is my privilege and honor to invite Clay Davidson, who is the grandchild of Holocaust survivors, a member of the Holocaust Museum LA's Teen Advisory Board, and ninth grade student at De Toledo High School, who will now lead us in the national anthems of the United States of America and Israel. Clay?
Oh, say, can you see by the dawn's early light what so proudly we hailed at the twilight's last gleaming, whose broad stripes and bright stars through the perilous fight o'er the ramparts we watched were so gallantly streaming, and the rocket's red glare, the bombs bursting in air, gave proof through the night that our flag was still there. Oh, say, does that star-spangled banner yet wave o'er the land of the free and the home of the brave? Kolot balevav penima, ayin letzion ofia, ufalte mizrach kadima, ayin letzion Sophia. ירושלים, להיות עם חופשי בארצנו, ארץ ציון ירושלים. It is now my honor to introduce Consul General of Israel, Dr. Hillel Newman.
Shalom. Good afternoon. Mayor Garcetti, elected officials, distinguished participants, Holocaust survivors. I'd like to open with acknowledgement to the Museum of Holocaust LA for hosting this event and for all they do for Holocaust education and preservation of the memory of the Holocaust. This is what we call sacred work, Melechet Kodesh. Friends, we mourn together and remember the 6 million Jews who were murdered by the Nazis in the Holocaust. 1 out of 3 Jews on the face of the earth were murdered at that time. We will not let the world forget the horror that engulfed the Jewish people during the Holocaust. We vow never again, but we know that the disease of anti-Semitism still prevails and evil still exists. We are fearful that it can happen again. As the senior representative of the State of Israel here in California, I can assure you that the State of Israel is the greatest guarantor that never again is not a slogan but a commitment. The Jewish people now enjoy the reality of the re-established State of Israel, which stands strong, dedicated to the safety and security of Jewish communities around the world. Who would believe that only 80 years after the Holocaust, hatred against Jews reaches new records? The recent ADL report documented the fact that in 2021, anti-Semitic incidents reached the highest number on record since 1979 across virtually every category. The state of California witnessed a substantial increase, 27%, of hate crimes against Jews in 2021. Jews are consistently the most targeted religious community in the United States. Hatred against Jews has taken on a new form, discrimination against and demonization of the one and only Jewish state, Israel. This is classic anti-Semitism masked as anti-Zionism. Since the beginning of my mission here in California, only 2 years ago, we have experienced attacks on Jews on the streets of LA, at a sushi restaurant, anti-Semitic flyers distributed to homes in Beverly Hills and Hollywood, graffiti on synagogues, and even the desecration of Torah scrolls in synagogues. Our lessons from the Holocaust are many, but I will mention one important guiding principle. There is a very thin line between slander and physical violence. There is a very thin line between the burning of books and the burning of flesh. Everything should be taken seriously and acted upon, including verbal abuse, graffiti, and flyers. We should not stand aside and hope that it will pass, but we must take a stand. We do appreciate the great leadership of Los Angeles, led by the Honorable Mayor who sits here with us and elected officials and the law enforcement authorities, as we witness their presence here today, that stand publicly with the Jewish communities and take such attacks seriously. We encourage the prosecution to indict such crimes as hate crimes. We encourage all to adopt the IHRA working definition of anti-Semitism in public discourse and implement the anti-BDS laws fully. The severity required is true for terrorist organizations and state actors alike. If the charter of Hamas states that they aspire to kill the Jews, and the leaders of Iran state that they wish to annihilate the state of Israel, we should take it seriously. My friends, this event has chosen to highlight the experiences of Eastern European Jewry during the Holocaust. So I will conclude with one story, a true story. It is the story of my father. My father, named Jacob Israel, was born in Czechoslovakia to a family of 6 siblings and loving parents. His father, my grandfather, who I never met, hosted in their home 2 guests in 1938 who stressed the gravity of the situation and implored them to leave as soon as possible. They said they would send fake invitations to a conference and they should all leave. My father's sister one day announced that she's leaving with a boat organized by the Zionists, and she took off the next evening on her own to Israel. That was the last time she saw her parents and family. The family received the fake invitations and deliberated what to do. My father's brother refused to leave his parents to an unknown fate on their own, so he remained. My father was the only one out of the family who took up on the invitations and left. That was the last time he saw his parents and family. My grandfather, my grandparents, and 3 remaining siblings perished. Allow me to share with you that the 2 guests who stayed with my grandfather and sent the fake invitations were spies on behalf of the yet undeclared state of Israel. Due to that, my father remained throughout his life an ardent Zionist. But my father carried guilt throughout his life, finding self-fault in the fact that his brother remained loyal to the parents and perished, and yet he survived. I grew up with a strong feeling that I'm a second-generation survivor, and I believe that due to these circumstances, I stand here before you as a Zionist and a diplomat on behalf of the State of Israel. The State of Israel, built out of the ashes of the Holocaust, is now the largest center of Jews in the world and bears that moral commitment of being a safe haven for the afflicted and never forgetting. Perhaps for this reason, Israel, a small country, now absorbs thousands of refugees from Ukraine, the majority of which are not Jewish. Israel currently holds one of the highest rates per capita per GDP of absorbing refugees from Ukraine. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Consul General, for those nice remarks. It is my pleasure to now invite Mayor Eric Garcetti, Council Member Paul Koretz, Board Member and 2G Stephen Greinberg, filmmaker and 3G Guy Nativ and his daughter, 3G Natalie Ziering, and members of our staff who are also 3G for the candle lighting ceremony.
The first candle is for the Ukrainian victims past and present in Kyiv, in Odessa, Lviv, and Babi Yar, innocent people murdered under the cover of war.
The second candle is for the rescuers, the righteous among nations, those who risked or gave their lives to save others.
The third candle is for the 1.5 million Jewish children who were murdered, torn away from their families, and never given the chance at life.
This fourth candle is for the survivors, like my grandparents, whose testimony ensures that we never forget, whose courage and resilience inspires future generations.
This fifth candle is for the countless victims, Ashkenazi, Sephardic, Mizrahi, across Europe, North Africa, and the Mediterranean basin, whose names we do not know, whose families and traditions went with them, who have no one left to light a candle for them.
This sixth candle is for the survivors in our community who passed this year: Lydia Budgor, Peter Daniels, Peter Epstein, Edith Franke, Barbara Gerson, Erwin Goldstein, Jack Greinberg, Ernst Haker, William Harvey, Marie Kaufman, Ruth Meller, Mel Mermelstein, Joseph Sands, and Max Sands. Thank you.
It is now my pleasure to introduce Jeff Abrams, ADL Los Angeles Regional Director.
Thank you, Beth. I stand up here today not only as the Regional Director of ADL Los Angeles, but also as the son of Sheldon Abrams, my father of blessed memory, who was born on Kristallnacht, who I may have had a very different future. Our family may have had a very different future had he been born not in Providence, Rhode Island, but in Europe. We all sit here and stand here today to commemorate the lives, the possibilities that were lost 80 years ago. And we're also here to honor the resilience of those who survived, the miracle of the return to life around the world, as well as here in Los Angeles, as lives were rebuilt and families sought to ensure that the world would truly never forget what had happened. And at this year's commemoration, we are particularly focused on Eastern Europe to honor the memory of the atrocities that occurred, and in many of those same places on this very day, atrocities are reoccurring. As I was outside before we began and see the memorial, talks about the deportation of people, talks about the erasure of history, and commemorates the 1,532,000 lives lost in Ukraine. We've also recently seen a spike here in hatred of anti-Semitism in Los Angeles, where we have seen on our very streets attacks on Jews at a restaurant on La Cienega simply because they were Jewish. We've seen Orthodox Jews in this neighborhood chased through a parking lot by vehicles. And we've seen recently this vile flyering in our neighborhoods. All of which, as has been mentioned at ADL, we have been tracking these anti-Semitic incidents for over 40 years. And unfortunately, 2021 was the worst year on record around our country. Over 2,700 incidents of anti-Semitism, of harassment, of vandalism, of assault. Here in Los Angeles alone, we saw over 180 incidents, a rise of 29%. And this is not isolated to Los Angeles, it's around our country. And in addition to these outright acts of hatred, we're also seeing a new plague of this analogy, of this use of Nazi, of Holocaust language, comparing what is occurring with vaccines, what is happening even in Israel, using language comparing it to what happened during the Shoah, which has no place, because in doing so, we lose the uniqueness of what happened and that unique evil. And this is why we at ADL are so committed to education, so committed with partners like we're here today with the Holocaust Museum of Los Angeles, educating, because we know that ultimately the best medicine, the best response to all this hatred is through education. And so I thank the museum, I thank all of the elected officials here today for using your loud voice, for leading, because that's what we all need right now. So now it's my great pleasure to introduce the Honorable Zev Yaroslavsky, who served the Los Angeles community for nearly 4 decades, first as a city council member and then as a 3rd District representative at the LA County Board of Supervisors. But even before he started his career in politics, as a UCLA student, Zev was a social justice activist, organizing protests against the oppressive treatment of Jews in the Soviet Union, and has never stopped leading and using his voice. Please welcome Zev Yaroslavsky.
Thank you, Jeff. And thank you for all the great work that ADL does, along with our other Jewish defense agencies. Consul General Lasinski. Jaroslaw is a very good name. I want you to, that's as far as my Polish goes, but, and Mayor Garcetti, of course. Thank you all for inviting me to give a keynote speech. This will be the shortest keynote speech you've ever heard, or at least the shortest I've ever given, because Rabbi Egger took half of my remarks away, and the rest of the remarks, Hillel, you took away. So you're blessed. I was thinking about this for a couple of weeks. What do you say on Yom HaShoah? What's left to be said that hasn't already been said? So I went to some of Elie Wiesel's writings because he, more than anything else, focused on memory, remembering. And here's one that I thought would be a nice way to, an appropriate way to start off what I wanted to say. He said, "For the dead and the living, we must bear witness. Not only are we responsible for the memories of the dead, we are responsible for what we do with those memories." And what I want to talk about briefly is what we do with those memories. First of all, let's remember the dead, because they're not dead as long as we remember them. They're not dead as long as we memorialize them, remember their names, remember where they came from, remember what could have been of their lives, especially the 1.5 million children who perished in the Holocaust. So we must bear witness, and we must bear witness to our co-generation populations, some of whom are not educated about the Holocaust, some of whom don't believe it, and some of whom maliciously deny it. That's what we, as survivors in the broader sense, the offspring of those who survived, of those who were not in Europe any longer when the Holocaust occurred, we have to be the voices of those who can no longer speak, as we always have been. I used to say this when I was a young councilman. I'm not a young councilman anymore. And now it's my kids, and in fact, my grandkids, to whom I have to pass on this story. In talking to my son this morning, I wanted to bring my 7-year-old. He said, doesn't want to bring the 7-year-old yet. Not ready for this kind of a discussion, but he will be soon. Because like the Seder, when we talk about our slavery in Egypt, this is a story that has to be told not just every year, but every day. And then the issue is, what do we do with these memories of our perished brethren? Well, they will have died in vain if our mouths remain shut, if we don't stand up when injustice is inflicted. And it doesn't matter whether it's inflicted on the Jewish community or on Uyghurs in China or on Rohingya in Myanmar or on women in the Congo, or unfortunately there's a long list, too long to go through here, of places where human rights, atrocities, genocides of one scale or another are taking place. And we can't be bashful about standing up against them. Our pulpit leaders have to speak out even if it offends some of their congregants. Our politicians need to speak up, even if it offends their base. What we've learned, some of us, I think, who studied history understood that this was always possible almost anywhere. I think we've now understood that fascism, extremism, authoritarianism can happen anywhere if the ingredients are there. We can't take our own democracy for granted anymore. How sad is that? And then we have people in our society, not just here, not just on campuses, who question the very foundation of the Jewish state, who make a distinction between anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism. Beg your pardon, it's a distinction without a difference. To be anti-Zionist is to be anti-Jewish. Zionism is the ideological underpinning of the Jewish state. You no more attack Zionism and get away with not being called an anti-Semite than you would criticize the Declaration of Independence and not be called anti-American. It's absurd. And we have to stand up. So whether it's our community, our homeland, or whether it's somebody else's homeland, or whether it's atrocities in Ukraine, I have to tell you that it's been a heartbreaking experience for me. My parents both came from Ukraine. My mother came from Poltava, which has been bombed by Putin. My father came from Belia Tserkov, 50 miles southwest of Kiev, been bombed by Putin. My grandmother came from a town in central Ukraine, Romny. I don't know whether it's been bombed, maybe too small to be bombed. My grandmother's two sisters, one came to New York. She went back, my grandmother went back to Russia, ended up moving to St. Petersburg, Leningrad at the time, was a nurse, survived the siege. Putin's one-year-old older brother perished in the siege of Leningrad. What an irony that is. And my third relative, my great aunt, my grandmother's second sister, perished in one of the many, many hundreds of Babi Yars that took place all over Ukraine. So I've had, when I listen to the news, my two aunts on my father's side lived in Kharkiv in Ukrainian. I spent a week in Kharkiv. I was surprised when the CNN reporter said that Kharkiv was a charming town. It wasn't when I was there, but maybe I missed something. But that's where they were. And so all of these towns, I'm sure all of you have gone through the same experience. Some of these towns where there were great rabbis who lived in it, where there's a Jewish historical reason for that, or historical connection to that city. It doesn't matter whether you're a small town or a big city, whether you're an apartment building or a steel factory, whether you're a child or a soldier, you're being massacred in what is got to be one of the great cruelties since World War II. We have to speak up about that. And all of us have to do something about it, not just sit in front of the television and watch it. So I want to close with a comment made by a mentor of mine, Rabbi Harold Schuldweiss, Zichrono Livracha, who was the rabbi at Valley Beth Shalom for many years, and sparked the idea for an organization called Jewish World Watch, which I have been involved with for a number of years, where he challenged his congregation and the broader community that who else but the Jewish community is better equipped morally and historically to stand up against genocide, given our history. And here's what he said in 2013. To avert my eyes from the torment of others, to stuff my ears from their shrieks, is to deny the kinship of human suffering and my own humanity. Am I created to only be a bystander, a passive voyeur gazing at the dying of human dignity? What defines the meaning of my existence, he asked. The philosopher defined existence by declaring, I think therefore I am. The existentialist wrote, I feel, therefore I am. The poet recited, I imagine, therefore I am. But our tradition declared, because you suffer, therefore I am. For if you suffer and I pretend deafness, muteness, or paralysis, I am reduced to a yawn, a breath, vanity of vanities, a cipher floating in the wind. Let us memorialize our brethren who perished in the Holocaust by not becoming ciphers floating in the wind. May their memory be a blessing. Thank you very much. Now it's my privilege to, it's my privilege to, actually it's very ironic. When I was leaving office in 2014, at this very ceremony, Mayor Garcetti, who had just become mayor, made some nice comments about me as I was going out the door. Now he's going out the door. And I don't want to make all those very fine comments, but I refer you to the comments he made about me. He served ably during his almost 9 years now as the mayor of our city, member of our community, and I think his legacy will be many. He has many legacies, but I think the manner in which he handled and led not just the city, but this region during the COVID pandemic in the last 2 years was nothing short of remarkable. So with that, I wish you well, Mayor Eric Garcetti.
Thank you so much to my dear friend and mentor and longtime colleague. And I'm ending my local service after 21 years. I'll never be able to match because of term limits the number of years, and thank God for that. But Zev, you have always been a light for our community and a light for this city and this region, and I appreciate you. I could restate everything I said in 2014 and mean it from my heart. Thank you, too, to my fellow elected officials who are here, to Paul Koretz, who served almost as long as Zev Yaroslavsky, and Ron Galperin, and thank you to our consuls general. Hillel, dear friend, who for 2 years, two of the toughest years, has led not only Israel's mission here, but connected us within the Jewish community and from the Jewish community to our other communities. And to Consul General Lasinski, thank you so much for being here as well. Like Zev Yaroslavsky, the borders have changed over time, so we can find our ancestors in all sorts of modern day countries, but they include Poland for me as well. I think Zev could have quite easily been our first elected Jewish mayor, but that burden felt on my shoulders. There was one Jew, as some of you may know, who was the city council president in the late 1800s, and when the mayor died, for 2 exciting weeks we had a Jewish mayor, so I'm not the first, but the first elected. He ran for mayor, but when they figured out he was Jewish at that time, he didn't win. But it was a testament that in this city, actually, Jews have led for a long time. The first head of our Chamber of Commerce, one of the first religious institutions built in the New Pueblo, was Jewish, and we've seen great people who have stepped forward at important times. And I want to thank all of the folks that come here at this incredible museum. Beth, you are an angel in this city of angels, and so is this entire board and Guy and everybody who spends time to make sure that these are not just holes in a wall, but these are memories in our hearts. It's so tough to do this, Zev, you are right. Every year, you dig deeper and deeper into the dirt to find something that hasn't been said so beautifully by somebody before you, or even by yourself maybe in a previous year. How do you find the feeling and the connection with something that the further time goes, the more distant it can feel? And I think for me, it's always the 3 N's. It starts with numbers, and we say the numbers because it's so large, the 6 million, the 1.5 million, but it's so overwhelming that we can't wrap our head around numbers alone. So then we go to the narratives, whether it's here in person from survivors, whether it's Hollywood. They find maybe one person, and they always find the happy outcome, because to tell most of the stories, they are not happy endings. We couldn't contain it. We couldn't somehow be able to shoulder those burdens. But how do we go to the 3rd N, which we always say, which is the never again? What action that we take, and how do we take it from each generation, midor lador, from generation to generation, to make sure that those who will be born soon never having met somebody who survived. I think about this because just a few years ago I met who I think was probably the last survivor of the Armenian genocide. She came to City Hall, and I felt that I, for the rest of my life, until I have no more breath in my life, have to pass on the experience of having met her to others to make sure nobody ever denies. I was so proud of our president to finally be on the record to say that that was a genocide, as we have always said here in Los Angeles. How is it that we can take that and take memory and remembrance and make it real? It starts obviously and first and foremost with the Holocaust, to tell that story, which our community has done, which the state of Israel has done so powerfully, which this country has done through the National Holocaust Museum. But then we go out from our own circle to the concentric circles of the communities that we touch and that have touched us. Before the marches for racial justice and reckoning happened in this city and around the country, about a year and a half earlier, I started a new mission here in the city of Los Angeles of civic memory. How do we unearth those stories that connect with the same sort of pains that we remember when we remember the Holocaust? Did you know here in the city of Los Angeles, the largest last mass lynching in American history was not in the American South, it was here, when dozens upon dozens of Angelenos of Chinese descent were lynched near what was then Chinatown, footsteps from where City Hall and the county buildings are today. And what do we do to put up more than a plaque, but to remember those names? Some of the names that we just know from a first name or a nickname or don't even know at all. What do we do to make sure we know the land that we're on here today, which was once Tongva and Chumash, and those native inhabitants that were themselves enslaved in a mission system quite often, that they too, those stories like the children and the holes in this wall, were ended or changed irrevocably. And what do we do, as Jeff so powerfully said, and thank you to the ADL and all of our Jewish defense organizations who stepped forward to see it in our lives, because as we were chatting just outside, I wouldn't have thought 5 years ago as an American Jew, I would be in my shul, there with my compatriots of other religions, those Muslim Americans and Christian Americans and Baha'i Americans who were there saying we are sorry for what happened in a synagogue in this country in this day and age. The attacks on our street as people eat outdoors. We've always shown up because it is part of our obligation as Jews. It is part of our identity as Jews. But now we're calling in those friendships in a way that is scary and seems to be out of another era. Well, if we connect those numbers and we remember and tell those narratives and we say never again, it leads us to one inevitable place, which is to be able to come together and step up and speak out when we see what we see and we know what we know. Like Zev, I have family that linked to modern-day Ukraine. My great-grandfather fled in 1906, just a year after about 1,000 plus Jews were killed in Odessa, from Odessa, but he was from what was then called Nikolaev, now Mykolaiv, just up the river, a place that was also ceaselessly bombed and did not fall in this war. And I was reading those on Ancestry.com, and thank you to our Mormon brothers and sisters for documenting everything that we have forgotten to do, because for $30 a month, you can check this all out yourself. But I looked in there and looked at these documents of the manifests of when he left in the midst of that, in the same place that we see today, people in the face of aggression losing their lives. It's not very difficult to know what we have to do. It's to continue to do that organizing and that raising of money and that sending of protection. And yes, sometimes that raising up of arms. We wish for peace in this world, but sometimes we have to meet force with force in order to preserve the life that we have. And so in conclusion, I just want to thank this museum, which has been a cornerstone for me as an elected official, but will remain as an Angeleno, as a city council president to dream of this happening, to have a small role, as mayor to see it expand. We need to make sure that this place, and those who are watching, if you've never come to this museum, come and hear those stories from our survivors who are here today. They're harder working than anybody I know. They come and they tell their stories, and you'll hear them here today. And know that that end of making sure never again is not a slogan, but an act daily is what our destiny is. Thank you very much. Let me invite forward now a man that Zev's named after, Consul General Jaroslaw Lasinski, to come forward to say some words from the state of Poland. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, we have gathered today to commemorate the 6 million Jews who perished in the Holocaust as a result of atrocities committed by Nazi Germany. Yom HaShoah, the Holocaust and the Heroism Remembrance Day, is inseparably linked with Poland, as it was on Polish soil that most of the infamous death camps were built and operated by German occupying forces. The history of Poland and the history of the Jewish people are histories that have long been intertwined. For centuries, Poland housed millions of Jews. Instead of place of exile, they found home where they could thrive and preserve their heritage. By the end of 18th century, more than 2/3 of world's Jewish population lived within the borders of the vast Commonwealth of Poland. It was no accident that so many found home in Poland. The coexistence of Christians and Jews, living in a multinational country proud of its tolerance, was a landmark policy of the Kingdom of Poland. In 1939, more than 10% of inhabitants of Poland were Jews, making Poland Europe's largest Jewish community. Yet, it ended abruptly with the onset of the Second World War. Poland was invited and occupied by the Third Reich and was witness to Hitler's final solution, which wiped once vibrant Jewish community from the face of earth almost in its entirety. As the result of the war, Poland lost 6 million citizens. 90% of pre-war Jewish population perished. More than 3 million in all. Poland was changed forever. We shall never forget the victims of the Holocaust. It is of utmost importance to keep in the human's memory this unprecedented tragedy. Poland, because of its history, Poland has the moral obligation to be the guardian of truth of the Holocaust. The message that we remember the victims of the Holocaust, the tragedy of the Shoah, is of utmost importance, is very important, especially right now as we watch the rising anti-Semitism all over the world. Remembering the horrors of Holocaust and the Second World War is also vital amid shocking and rising levels of ignorance about the world's most deadliest conflict. Ladies and gentlemen, the hatred and the lack of respect for human life is omnipresent. For the last 2 months, we watched horrors, an unprovoked and unjustified war in Ukraine, the senseless loss of life of women, children, men, the destruction of entire cities and villages. Poland stands in solidarity with all innocent victims of hatred, oppression, and aggression. We also condemn Russian propaganda's ludicrous claims of fighting Nazis in Ukraine or seeking to denazification of the country. This amounts to a distortion and trivialization of the Holocaust. Simply, we cannot allow this. Thank you. And now we have a special performance by Sonia Matthews from the USC Tarleton School of Music and the Polish Music Center, performing Moods for Unaccompanied Oboe by Joachim Stutschewsky. Stutschewsky was a Ukrainian composer who incorporated many Hasidic and klezmer melodies into his compositions. He fled his home in 1938 to Palestine, but his pieces evoke a sense of musical tradition that perished.
Thank you so much, Sonia. My name is Rachel Podber, and as the Education Programs Manager at Holocaust Museum LA, I have the incredible privilege of working with students across and beyond Los Angeles every day. I'm also here as a representative of our third generation, or 3G community, which is comprised of the grandchildren of Holocaust survivors. My grandfather, Abe Podber, of blessed memory, was born Avram Podborewski in September 1919 in the town of Vishneve, Poland, which is now in Belarus. My grandfather always said that a shovel saved his life. In 1941, he and other Jewish men were arrested and taken to the woods near his town. There were 35 men digging a massive ditch into which other Jews were being shot. He noticed one shovel sticking out of the dirt, grabbed it, and started digging. The men digging were the only people not shot that day. The split-second decision to pick up the shovel had saved his life. Later, he would witness from a hiding place in the woods as the rest of the Jews in the ghetto, around 1,200 people, were forced into the Vishneve synagogue, which was locked by Nazis and set on fire. In the fire, my grandfather lost his sisters and their families, his father, and his mother, Rachel, for whom I was named. He was later found and imprisoned in Stutthof and then in one of the Galperin subcamps of Dachau, and was liberated by American soldiers in 1945. During an oral history interview in 1984, my grandfather was asked why he chose to relive his trauma and share his story. He said, "It's the truth. The new generation, they've got to know." The stories of our survivor community are the heartbeat of our museum's mission. We know that now more than ever, it is crucial to ensure that their stories continue to be shared. Since the beginning of 2022, over 10,000 students have participated in survivor talks at Holocaust Museum LA. To all of our survivor speakers, I say thank you for sharing your stories with us to ensure that the truth lives on. It is my honor and privilege to now introduce Dana Schwartz, a survivor from Lviv. Dana was 4 years old when Poland was invaded by Nazi forces and survived the Holocaust with her mother. She has been a member of our museum community for over 40 years and has shared her experiences with thousands of students to ensure that the lessons of the Holocaust are never forgotten. Thank you so much, Dana. Please join me in welcoming Dana Schwartz.
Lower. Okay, got it. Thank you, Mayor. Yes, I guess I should have had one of those. But you can see me. I have spoken to a lot of the schools that we bring in here and educate, and I have gotten amazing letters from those kids, which tells me that what we're doing is really important. They're all very touched by the holes here, but not nearly as much as I. Because when I look, I remember the people I knew who did not survive. I'm going to talk to you about a little bit about my experience. I'll start with the ringing of the doorbell. I was 5. No, I was 6. I was in Lviv, Poland, which is now Lviv, and I was very surprised when my mother opened the door, and I saw this amazing, huge man dressed in what I thought were very beautiful clothes. It was a German uniform with lots and lots of medals and very high black boots. And there were two men behind him, and he rang the doorbell and said he wanted to see our apartment. And of course, my mother led them in wordlessly, and they walked around, and he had a monocle and he had his hat, and he had a big coat on his shoulders. He looked around and he liked what he saw. He kept saying, very nice, very nice. I said, Mommy, he likes our place. Be out in a half hour. You can each take a valise, small valise. Goodbye. We had to leave. My mother and my father worked their shoulders. They pushed them back. They put their heads up high, not to scare me and not to make it a terrible experience that it was, but I knew that I was never going to see my dolls that opened and closed their eyes, and my teddy bear, and my home and my childhood again. So I was 6, and we had to go to the ghetto, and we took with us my grandmother and another old lady who was alone, and my uncle who was younger than my dad, and he taught physics in high school. And we all went to this tiny little place in the ghetto. The ghetto was cold and scary. People kept disappearing. But we were still together, my mother and father and I. One day, my father came home from looking around the ghetto, and he had a big bulge in his coat. He pulled out the bulge, and it was a whole bread. So he carved the bread, and the very top went to me. And it was so delicious. It filled my mouth. It was fresh. It was so good. A whole bread. It was gritty, really, but it was wonderful to have, to fill my mouth with something so amazing. He said, after I ate the bread, there is something happening. There is an action going on. An action is just like a cowboy's herding cattle and onto the cattle trains and into the slaughterhouse. That's exactly what the Germans did to the Jews. Everybody had to leave their apartments. They went after them to make sure that no one was hiding. My dad decided with some other guys next door to put the 2 old ladies, my grandmother and the other old lady, into a room with some others, and then shove a big cupboard in front of the door so the Germans wouldn't know there was another room there. They found them. Maybe they saw the wallpaper off color or the floor scratched up, I don't know. But we went under the house. Under the building, there was a hole where they threw a lot of old bottles. How I got there, I don't remember. But I woke up that morning, and I sat up, and I was in a hole. And there were, I don't know if 12 people or 8 people or maybe even just 6, I'm not sure. There were people lying like in a sardine can. And I got up. By then I was 7. I said, Mommy. And then Mommy was right next to me, and then Daddy. Mommy, I have to pee. You pee when the bottle comes around, she said. And I said no, and yes, I did, because she said everybody would turn their heads, and they did. So we were stuck in this hole for a long time. My dad had a box of sugar cubes, not a whole box. It wasn't filled, but there were sugar cubes there. And he would pop sugar cubes into my mouth, and I had enough calories to survive. we had water because at 3 o'clock in the morning we would crawl out, and there was a spigot in the courtyard, and we washed the different bottles for the different things, and the men would lead an exercise class because they were afraid that their legs would atrophy from being there. So it was okay. But one night, a lady came in with a tiny, tiny baby at her breast. And we were terrified. If the neighbors, the non-Jewish neighbors who were still there, some of them, when they hear that there's a baby and there are Jews down there under the building, of course they're going to let them know. The Germans know. And so we were terrified when we saw the baby. The baby would cry, and that would be the end of us all. But the baby was too weak to cry. Just kept moving its mouth, but nothing happened. She had 2 toddlers. And I don't know whether they were boys or girls. They were all wrapped up. They sat she laid next to me. They sat at her feet, and there was a boy, I call him David. He was like maybe 12, and he kept saying to his mother, "Let me go and find some food. You have no food to have milk. I have to go. I have to go. You know, if Dad hadn't been caught, he would have let me go and find food for you." And she kept saying no, and she was right next to me, and I saw her eyes. "No," she said, but then she said yes. And he kissed the 2 toddlers, and he kissed the baby, and he kissed his mother, and he said, "I'll be all right." And he left it. I want to tell you how some of the kids in the ghetto got food for their families. They would find a manhole. They would crawl down the manhole when they saw no one there, and they would go down to the sewers. They would walk next to in the sewers for a very, very long time. It was a big city. And when they came to the country, when they came to the fields, and the fields had already been harvested, they would find an occasional carrot or a potato or whatever. They would tie their pants at the bottom, and they'd stick it in, and then they would take the trek back through the sewer. And when they came to a manhole, they would lift it and look around to see if anyone was looking. The Germans found that out, and they had a party looking, standing around, smoking and cocking their guns and waiting for the first movement. They would pull the kid out. They would tell them to undo their pants and shake them. If one piece of fruit or vegetable fell out, they got the honor of a shot in the head. Why was it an honor? They knew that these kids were all going to die a horrible death, and this was a clean death, and that was the honor. Lady next to me, her eyes close to me. He never came back, and I saw it all in her eyes. It was terrifying for everybody in that hole. And we went out. My mother whispered with my dad, took me by the hand, and went to a neighbor who was just moving out. They were not Jewish. They were just moving out, and she said, "Look, I have this ring. It's a lovely ring. Wouldn't you like to have it? I need a week of knowing that my child is safe. Would you take my child with you?" And she said yes. The next morning, we went to their new apartment. I was put into a room, a bedroom that was totally devoid of furniture, but there was a huge hill of newspapers. It was very cold. I didn't know what to do. But when night came, I decided to try to burrow myself into the newspaper. And so I did. And for a week, I was able to cope with the cold because it was kind of warm enough in there. While she knew that I was okay for a week, she knocked on the door of a guy further down, and she said, "Look, I have this beautiful blue ring. It's very nice, and I thought maybe you would want to take it and hide me for a week. Hide me outside the ghetto." And he said, "Oh, yeah, sure." He took the ring, and he took her to an office which only had a table, but no bathroom, no water, nothing. And he said, "I'll be back and I'll bring you water." He never came. She was locked in this room without anything, and he never came. And she knew that she had a very short time to live. And she looked out the window, was the second floor, and she kept looking for him. Was he coming? Was he coming? And she saw a big branch, and she decided to try. The only thing she could do was lunge onto that branch and work her way to the trunk and then down, which she did. And she remembered that my nanny lived nearby. She found her, and she was up on the last top floor. She knocked on the door, and she said, "Hide me, Maria, please hide me. I'm so thirsty, I'm so hungry. Won't you take care of me?" And she said, "I can't do it. I can't let you in because my husband will give you away. But if you sit on the top step, I'll take care of you when he leaves. When he goes to sleep, sorry." So she did. She took her downstairs to the cellar. And in the cellar, they had several rooms. Everybody had a room where they could stash their folding beds or whatever. And there was a folding bed there. And she brought her soup, and she brought her hot potatoes, and she opened the bed. And my mother had a few days of peace and dark and quiet to relax. And then suddenly she heard boots. The Nazis were there. Even here in the Aryan section, we have to check you up, make sure that no Jews are hiding here. They cocked their guns. They said, "Janitor, come here." He had a big ring full of keys, and he started to open the doors, one after the other. My mother knew that it was her end, and she said the Shema, and she knew she was done. They came to her door, and he didn't have the key, and they said, "Well, where's the key?" "Well, the lady upstairs has the key." "Well, go get it." And they're standing there and waiting, and a dog comes, starts playing with them, runs away, starts playing with them, runs away again. They say, "Look, this dog must want to show us something." And as the janitor comes down with a key, they say, "Never mind. We want to see where this dog is taking us." The week passed. She came back. She apologized to the nanny, thanked her profusely, went back, was in the courtyard, wanted to go and dive into that hole, that secret hole. but instead just walked into the cellar. The man came at 12 o'clock on the day he was supposed to. He brought me back to the courtyard in the ghetto, and he left me there. And I thought, where's my daddy? Where's my mommy? Are they still alive? But I knew that I mustn't dive for that hole because people were watching, and they might give me away, and they might give everybody away. And so I slowly walked nearby and sat down with my hand on my mouth. And I said, "Are you there, Daddy? Are you there?" I whispered. And my father said, "Oh, thank you, sweetheart, for not giving us away. Go down to the cellar." He didn't tell me Mother was there because he would have, of course, I would have run. So my mother got more and more perturbed and wanted to get out of there. And for some reason, my dad was able to he met a man whom he knew, who knew that there was a way to buy fake papers. So what do you do when you get fake papers? You change your name, right, and your religion and everything. So my mother and Dad and I sat back in the apartment after the big action, and they said, "Well, what kind of name would we get?" Shapira is a very Jewish name, and one of them said, "Well, you know, everybody in Poland knows that Jews don't eat pig." So they sat there and tried to figure out a name, and sure enough, they found a name with the word bacon in it. So my name became Baconowski, and we had a very good laugh about that because, you know, anybody would know that somebody with a name Baconowski. So we had the fake papers, and I was slithered somehow out of the ghetto, and I still don't know how. My mother and I already took off our Star of David, signifying our Jewishness. My father couldn't because he was circumcised. And my father went out and found a man who sold eggs. He came by train from a tiny little village, and he sold eggs in the city. And as he was done selling eggs, my father offered him money if he would take us to his village as his cousins. And he said yes, he would. And so we had a very difficult goodbye with my father because we had a meeting with him, and it's a long story, but I was not allowed to either hug him or kiss him or smile at him or say anything to him because the guard was standing right there. And this was a financial transaction because between a Polish lady and this Jewish man, which was allowed. But I had to stand there with my arms down at my sides, never showing him how much I loved him and how I was afraid that I might never see him again. We said goodbye. He gave me a little sieve. He was lovely to look at, but I couldn't look. I had to turn around without looking back, and we walked where? You know, the railroad station in Lviv. And there we waited and waited, and the man showed up. The Eggman showed up. The Eggman took us to his village and found us a place well, it was really a farm and it was really a barn, but we found a place to sleep. My mother took me. My mother went to the baker. You know, there was a baker in this tiny little town, and my mother said, "You have a beautiful young wife, And I have 2 dresses from the city. And I have a platinum watch. And I have an engagement ring. I will give you everything. That's all I have if you just promise me bread every day. That's all we wanted. That's all we hoped for. And he said yes, and for 3 months he did really give us the bread. And that's how we lived in this small town. And I saw all the Jews of that town destroyed and taken away. They were all gone. And then when the Russians came and helped us and were nice to us instead of killing us, for which we were so grateful, they took us, they let us ride in back of a truck. I'm very good at riding in back of trucks. It took us back to the town, to the city of Lviv. And if I tell you that everyone was gone, everyone was gone. My mother heard that USSR was taking over for good. She threw me in back of a truck again. And we went out of there. And there were Jewish organizations a little bit, and they helped us, and we were very grateful. You know, all that money you send to Jewish organizations, they really work hard. After 5 years, I came to amazing America. That word has never been used more than as amazing, amazing, amazing. So I just want to tell you that even though it was very hard, we did it. My mother did it. She did amazing feats. Then she died, and I was an orphan at 17. And I managed to go to school, and I loved it. I loved school. I wanted so much to be in elementary school. I had never been in one, really, or barely. And so I became an elementary school teacher. I loved it. And I made a beautiful family. And it's been amazing. And I just want to give one word to my co-survivors who are now in the Ukraine and are suffering. And I want to give my regards to the few who survive, and we're still here, and we're still talking, and we're still so grateful that you're listening. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dana, for sharing your story. I've had the privilege and honor from learning from you for over 2 decades, I just realized the other day. You know, most people around the world have never, before a couple of months ago, probably never heard of your hometown, Lviv, or could find it on a map. And, you know, it makes us realize that the work that we're doing at the museum to preserve memories and artifacts is more important than ever as we see civilians dying and towns being wiped out and completely decimated. The work that we are doing at the museum to preserve artifacts, memories, culture is just really critical today. My name is Beth Keene. I'm the CEO of Holocaust Museum LA. As the granddaughter of Holocaust survivors, it's a privilege to join you on this commemorative day. I want to share a personal story that shows how this institution is a place of education, commemoration, and community. When we first opened this building in 2010, I shared how my grandmother taught me kindness. She maintained humanity in the most dehumanizing moments in her life. As a prisoner in the Ravensbrück concentration camp, she was randomly selected to work in the kitchen peeling potatoes, a coveted but dangerous job for someone who's starving. Instead of just keeping the scraps to herself, she would clandestinely toss peels to passing women or sneak them back to the barracks, helping to sustain others. Mary Bauer, a survivor in our community who continues to tell her story to students at the museum, came up to me that day and said, "Your grandmother saved my life." When I walked past the kitchen in Ravensbrück, the girls tossed me potato peels. I looked at her kind of confused. I didn't really understand what she was saying. And then she also pointed out that if they had been caught, they would have been shot. It was at that moment, hearing from Mary, that made me understand for the first time, my grandmother wasn't just one of the lucky ones who peeled potatoes in the kitchen in Ravensbrück. She was this brave young teenager who knowingly risked her life and defied the Nazis. And I got to hear this firsthand from a survivor, halfway across the country, from Mary Bauer. So these are the messages that the students at our museum learn. It is our solemn and shared responsibility to preserve survivors' memories and steward their messages and stories of courage, resilience, and hope, now and into the future. Students today are the last generation to meet and learn from eyewitnesses and to hear firsthand of the fragility and strength of those who survived unthinkable circumstances. Isabella is a student who visited the museum from Fullerton High School, which is a Title I school in Orange County. I'd like to share something that she wrote after her visit. Thank you for your generosity in sharing the incredible experiences of Holocaust survivors. This program has given me a glimpse of the pain and suffering human hatred and ignorance can inflict upon the world. Thank you for preserving the memories of the lives lost due to vicious racial bias and animosity and showing us how we can avoid genocides such as the Holocaust. Thank you for inviting us and busing us over to your astounding museum and treating us with the same respect as adults. We are the last generation that has the opportunity of meeting these incredible survivors, and this is something that I will carry with me for the rest of my life and to pass on to the next generation. My generation has been tasked with keeping the memories of the survivors alive, and with their memory, spread the love that they so deserved. It gives us all a newfound appreciation for life and things that we take for granted. It makes us even more determined to prevent horrible tragedies from occurring. That was said by a high school student from Orange County. Students like that give me hope. Students like Isabella and thousands of visitors from diverse backgrounds that walk through the museum doors give me hope because I know that their lives are being changed forever. Holocaust Museum LA is committed to ensuring that generations of students like Isabella continue to learn from survivor stories and feel empowered to stand up against hatred, bigotry, and anti-Semitism. Together, we renew our commitment to never forget. I'd now like to call upon Los Angeles City Controller Ron Galperin, my friend, and the son of and grandson of Holocaust survivors, to recite the El Malay Rachamim and Mourner's Kaddish prayers.
Good afternoon. It's really a great honor to be with you here today. And thank you so much, Beth, and to all of the leadership of the Holocaust Museum Los Angeles and to my fellow officials, including the mayor from the city of Los Angeles, as we commemorate Yom HaShoah, and its full name is Yom HaShoah v'Hagvura, meaning it is the day of remembering the Shoah, but also remembering all of the bravery of those who not only survived, but helped others to survive. And as the son and grandson of survivors who are unfortunately no longer with me, I remember growing up in many ways in the shadow of the Holocaust with my grandparents who called the Shoah by what was its Yiddish name, which is the Churban, meaning the destruction. And I remember in years past coming here with my father, a survivor from Romania, and he passed away nearly 5 years ago. And actually this month would have been his 101st birthday. So I feel his presence very much with me. You know, they say le dor vador, the mayor actually mentioned this phrase, from generation to generation. And it's our task and our responsibility to carry forward the memories and the lessons of those who came before us. And my father was a rabbi, my great-grandfather was one, my great-grandfather was one, and I digressed from that path, although I married one. Last person I ever thought I would marry. And, you know, being a rabbi requires a bit of being political, and I guess being in politics requires a little bit of faith. But each of us passes to the next generation some traditions. And my father passed to me this tradition of the El Mare Rachamim, which is the prayer that we say in memory of those who have passed. And so for those of you who are able to stand, I welcome you to join with me for this El Mare Rachamim. El Mare Rachamim, shochein b'amromim, המצא מנוחה, מנוחה נכונה, תחת כנפי השכינה, במעלות קדושים וטהורים, כזוהר הרקיע, מזהירים את כל הנשמות של 6 מיליוני היהודים, חללי השואה באירופה, שנהרגו, שנשחטו, שנשרפו, ושנספו בידי המרצחים הנאצים ועוזריהם משאר העמים. לכן בעל הרחמים, אז תרם בצתר כנפך לעולמים, בצרור, בצרור החיים את נשמתם. אדוני הוא נחלתם, ינוחו בשלום על משכביהם. ונאמר Amen. God full of mercy, who dwells in the heights, provide a sure rest upon the divine presence's wings, within the range of the holy and the pure, whose shining resemble the skies, all the souls of the 6 million Jews, victims of the European Holocaust, who were murdered and slaughtered, burned, exterminated by the Nazis and their helpers. Therefore, Master of Mercy will protect them forever from behind the hiding of his wings, and will tie their souls with the rope of life. The everlasting is their heritage. The Garden of Eden shall be their resting place, and they shall rest peacefully upon their lying place. As we carry on their memories, and work to perpetuate ideals of never again. And let us say, Amen. And our tradition, of course, is the Kaddish. And for those of you who know it, please join me. Yitgadal v'yitkadash Shemeh Rabbah, be'alma divrach chirutei v'yamlich malchutei, b'chayechon u'v'yomechon, u'v'chayei d'chol Beit Yisrael, b'gala u'v'zman kari v'imru Amen. Yehi Shmei Rabba Mevorach Leolam Uleolmei Olmaya. Itbarach v'ishtabach v'itba'ar v'itromam v'itnasei. V'itadar v'itale v'talal Shmei Dekudisha Brichu. Le'ela min kol birchata v'shirata. Tush bechata v'nechemata. Damiran be'alma v'imru Amen. Yehi Shlomo Rabba min Shemaya. V'chaim aleinu ve'al kol Yisrael ve'al kol bnei Adam v'imru Amen. Oseh shalom bimromav, hu ya'aseh shalom, עלינו ועל כל בני ישראל ועל כל חיי תבל, ואמרו אמן. Thank you.
Thank you, Controller Galperin. You know, we usually have Yom HaShoah in a different section in the park, under a tent with a lot more people, but I just have to say that I feel like there definitely is something special about having the ceremony in this sacred space in the Jonah Goldrich Children's Memorial. And I do want to mention that this sacred space and our permanent location would never even have happened if it weren't for the tireless advocacy of people like Mayor Garcetti and the Honorable Zev Yaroslavsky, who I don't think is here anymore. But thank you so much for your support. You were here from the very beginning. And for all of the elected officials, we wouldn't even be able to do this expansion project without your help and support. So we're grateful. Thank you, everyone. Thank you for all of our speakers and participants, to everyone on the live stream. And please join us in our pledge to never forget.